Rolling Up, Chapter 3, Final Year of Apprenticeship. It was quite a shock to go back to my old job in 1956, after 2 years' national service. There had been many changes to the printing industry since my departure, and mainly to do with technical innovation within the film industry. 3 main factors transformed the printing of colour and type for all printing requirements. First, the manufacture of large-sized studio cameras. Second, the ability of film manufacturers to produce larger areas of film with a stable backing. And third, colour correction by overlay masking to compensate for the spectral deficiencies in the tri-process inks. From this time, photography ousted hand-drawn reproductions, and this was the end to fine art posters and autolithographs for coffee houses. Customer preferences in a now film-obsessed advertising world, where hand-drawn methods were old hat, wanted the latest high-tech methods. Advertising agencies sold space to clients on the use of the latest technology that sold hoarding space using keep up with all that's new. It was de rigueur as a sales gimmick, but not always best practice or advice. The object was, as always, to reduce the number of printings needed. Hand-drawn methods couldn't compete with the range of tone produced by the photographic half-tone screen. Immediate post-war publishers relied upon letterpress to produce the bulk of general print work. This includes newspaper and book production. Print runs for popular magazines became the prerogative of gravure printing simply because the gravure cylinder retained the image longer without changing. Lithography produced greetings cards, wrapping papers, labels and posters, whilst screen process, silkscreen, concentrated on signs and shop counter goods and packaging. It didn't take long for all this to change as new technologies came into being and working practices adapted to suit. The first process to feel the pinch was letterpress, whose hand-set type, superseded by hot metal production, gave way to photographic typesetting practices. Patched up and planned film incorporating half-tone pictures and lettering, exposed onto light-sensitive coated flexible metal plates, enabled the printing processes to take over much of the work previously printed by letterpress. I had to finish my apprenticeship by completing 1 more year. I was not to return to college or evening classes, and within a short time I found all the old skills returning, able to cope with everything a fully trained journeyman was asked to do. I was now paid £19 for a 45-hour week with 2 weeks' holiday. Before my national service, there had been very few union disputes. Men were returning home from the war, and life returning to how they had been pre-war. Houses had to be repaired, furniture bought, and children catered for. Now, 5 years later, in 1955, the unions were conscious that wages had to keep pace with the cost of living, and workers had greater expectations, an improving lifestyle. The dockers were complaining about age-old methods of unloading ships. The transport and general's closed shop arrangements were being challenged by the Dock Labour Board. The Electrical Trade Union refused to maintain the newspaper printing presses, and the locomotive engineers demanded a wage increase from the Transport Commission. It was constant friction throughout the 50s, and spelt the eventual demise of Britain's industrial sector over this 20-year period, from which it never returned. The spirit of England had changed since the Suez Crisis in 1956. I was about to be called up to serve in landing crafts. In 1 week the tone of the country altered when it was called the aggressor by the Americans. the whole campaign was viewed as gunboat politics. I thank God that it all died down and the troops returned home. Back to reality and normal life. After work, my journey home was from Neasden Station, a 7-minute walk from Cromerworks. On many occasions, Ken, who had attended the same school, gave me a lift in his new Ford Poplar, a car bought for him by his father for the price of just under £500. Ken worked in the drawing office at British Thompson Houston, an electrical engineering firm dealing with switchgear. We gave up many of our Friday evenings to the Wembley Town Hall dances, which were always well attended, and engaged first-class bands. Ted Heath, Ken Mackintosh, Eric Delaney, John Dankworth and Lou Stone, and most Saturdays we went to the pictures, for he was good company. We chatted away, covering most subjects, enjoying similar things. Filmgoers reached a peak in 1946, when 1/3 of the population was going at least once a week. The Korean War, Malaya and National Service reduced audiences steadily until the effects of television consistently lowered the graph. Trevor, another artist working in the same studio, had a motorbike. Not only did he understand its mechanics, but followed motorcycle racing. His girlfriend, Gladys, was engaged to him for 5 years, spending most of their time together planning their new home. He refused to marry her until he could buy a house, which he eventually did, furnishing it, finally building his own garage with the help of his father. Through his interest and a lot of prompting, I bought myself a black, rigid-framed, single-cylinder 350cc AJS from Pink's of Harrow. This faithful steed took me to work in all weathers. I kept this for a couple of years, stripping it down and polishing it, believing I was increasing its speed with every change of oil. Unfortunately, this never happened, for it only ever went at 60 miles per hour with my head down, throttle fully opened, and a following wind. I began to take on more and more difficult tasks at work, and eventually, after that first year, after coming out of National Service, I was able to take my place with the rest of the studio. For some reason that I'm grateful for, I was never banged out. This is an age-old method of celebrating the completion of an apprenticeship. The departing apprentice carried round the firm on the backs of his one-time fellows, whilst ink, soot and feathers thrown at him. All the artists were worried about their future employment, for during my 2 years' absence the industry had undergone enormous change. Advertisers believing that adopting the latest means of picture reproduction would help sell their wares. Colour reproductions were now going to be a photographic operation. Hand-drawn work now phased out. Printing was not the only industry to suffer from being out of date, lagging behind emerging Far East companies. Car and motorbike production boomed, as did the manufacture of components and accessories. But not for long. Hire purchase businesses doubled, and house building soared. Television competed with radio and the cinema, and won out. Independent television began in 1954, and extended 10 years later, increasing its membership. There was large-scale immigration from the West Indies, which were quickly absorbed by the railways. Overtime by the nation's workforce was an accepted way of raising one's living standard. Wembley Town Hall was the unlikely venue where I met Sally, my future wife. Ken and I went to a dance there just before Christmas 1955, having arranged the meeting the previous week. He picked me up at home as usual in his car, and as we mounted the wide steps to the town hall, we decided to have a drink first to take in the competition, and survey the land to plan our evening. The dance floor was certainly the largest in the vicinity. As a venue, it lacked an intimate atmosphere. The floor was so large that before the next dance there was this enormous void in the centre of the floor, which, to find a partner, had to be negotiated. When did pluck up enough courage to strike across the floor towards a likely girl, always concerned about one's fly-buttons undone or some other personal defect visible. What does one do with one's arms? Swing them, or shall I put my hands in my pockets and saunter over, feigning confidence? Did I always walk with a limp, I wondered, or is it these damn shoes slipping on the floor? It was equally daunting when being refused a dance by the girl, using one of the stock phrases, "Sorry, I'm waiting for my partner," "Oh, I'm sitting this one out," or "I promised this one to somebody else." The poor rejected soul had to either creep away, ask somebody else nearby, which never produced a good result, or carry on walking to the bar as if that had been his original idea in the first place. There was a distinct advantage to leaping to one's feet as soon as the next dance was introduced by the master of ceremonies, so that the choice of partner was secured at its highest point. The girls, who were the prettiest and could dance well, were always the most sought after. Without prior intelligence work you might be fooled, make the wrong choice, and then you had to stagger around the room with someone who had 2 left feet, had little or no conversation, or worse still, didn't want to dance with you. The whole object of the exercise, to find a girl who would be a good companion. At the end of all dances, the last waltz was announced. To be left without a girl to take home was the worst thing possible. I looked around and spotted someone in the crowd who I thought might be suitable. However, my request granted, missing the fact that she was with a friend. We took the floor. It seemed to go quite well. She danced easily. We chatted about the band, the choice of music, and her preferences for dances. It was the best dance of the evening, and I asked her if I could see her home. At this she replied that her friend was with her, and that they had come together, and it wouldn't be right to leave her alone. I immediately asked if she would go with me to a Christmas Eve dance above the Regal Cinema in Sudbury. At this she said she would. The date was fixed for meeting her there. The evening was a success. It was my greatest worry that we might not get on, and conversation stilted and time drag. However, it was not any of those things. It was enjoyable, and for the first time I felt at ease and more sure of myself. I walked her home, which was over a mile away, and time passed quickly. The parting kisses were a delight, and I said good night, arranging to meet her a few days' time. After Christmas she had her days planned long before. I walked happily back home over Harrow Hill, along the ridgeway, whistling a happy tune, at peace with the world. It didn't take me long to appreciate that this friendship was different. Our interests and feelings of togetherness were appreciably less stressful than my previous relationships. I don't think it was because I was becoming more adept, although getting older in itself would naturally do that. It was obviously the more experienced girl. She was interesting and interested, and made the relationship natural and exciting, and she actually wanted to be with me. From that time we saw each other at least twice a week, and gradually I grew to know her parents and her brother. It was comfortable. It was so easy for me to be included into the family circle, to take part in their home life. They lived next door to the Wilsons, and Colonel Wilson had been my father's corps commander in the Home Guard. Sally was born on the 14th of March 1932 to Harry and Rita Morgan at a nursing home in Chichester. Sally's father, born in 1899, served during the First World War in Mesopotamia in the Signal Corps. Harry appears in my memory as being slightly taller than I, therefore he was all of 6 foot, weighing 12.5 stone. He was a Welshman, born and bred in Neath, South Wales, his head of thick grey, wiry hair combed in a neat central parting. A grey moustache set off a cheerful, lined, weather-beaten face, more often than not wreathed in a smile. He was an inveterate smoker of Balkan Sobrani cigarettes, which he inhaled with relish, letting the smoke pass out through his teeth. This habit perfectly conjures up how he viewed life, particularly away from his work. which for him was a chore. He tried to be enthusiastic about all he did, had distinct views of most aspects of life, which he propounded, looking over the rim of his glasses and the Times newspaper. It was this paper's crossword which gave him his main form of relaxation. Harry was a rugby fanatic, especially Welsh rugby, at Cardiff Arms Park, and having been born in Neath, South Wales, he never ceased to extol the virtues of either the country or its citizens. To him, Dylan Thomas was its chief bard. He often recited under Milkwood many times, and the Welsh anthem and Men at Hark were his first choice of tunes. The harp was naturally the only instrument worth listening to, and the Welsh flag the only flag worth flying. He was a Welshman through and through. When I first knew him, he was the manager of Lloyd's Bank, Greenford, and considered his staff to be his main concern over all others. Throughout all his years, working his way up from cashier to manager, he had been a dedicated member of staff. Harry was disenchanted with modern banking methods. Head office required goals to be set for taking on new clients, continually increased the targets of how much money the bank processed. He wanted to retire. This took away contact with main clients he considered his friends. He was a member of the local Rotary Club and participated in their charity work, but couldn't wait to retire from the bank so that he could watch cricket at Lord's, watch westerns on the television, and go cycling. He was not a practical man, but proud. When he had wired up an electric plug or mended a puncture, he wanted to show it off. He was literate and enjoyed going to the theatre. Financially prudent, he appreciated and planned for a simple life, the delights of the English countryside and good company. He mostly wore light grey suits and striped shirts, and to my memory never wore a hat, nor ever wanted to. He was not somebody who would knowingly harm you, swear at you, raise his voice, but be gentle in all things. His wife Rita, née Hutchins, hailed from Woking, where the family ran a coal merchant's. They had met whilst Harry, chief cashier at the Chichester branch of Lloyd's Bank, and Rita worked at the county library as librarian. They both had an interest in Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and the theatre in general. Her father, moving out of the family home when she was young, forced the mother to raise the girls. This event had a great influence on her sister Grace, who thought little of her father for deserting her mother and children for another woman. Bren, still lived in Woking. It was not until much later that her son Raymond, who worked for the local authority, married Valerie and continued to reside near the family home. Rita had been a star pupil at school, winning numerous prizes, which also upset her sister, who tried much harder. But she didn't receive due reward or recognition. She was only about 5 feet 4 inches tall and slight in frame, but strong-willed, determined and resolute, totally believed in women's liberation. Rita was perceptive, relished testing other people's opinions and reactions, and once set on a task she persevered until finished. Rita was a home builder and delighted in keeping up with the latest fashions. Not popular mass market fashions, but accepted appearance of good taste. Her home at Sudbury Hill was always immaculate. The furniture was mostly of polished wood, and the chairs had loose plain covers. Her favourite colour green, which showed in the colour of the carpets and drapery. Most of the curtains she made herself, taking great pains to ensure that the hanging lengths were perfect. Tea laid in the dining room, arranged in a uniform setting, small iced cakes, tarts, flapjacks, homemade, and bought almond cake were the usual fare. Rita at one end of the table, with Harry serving cups of tea facing her at the other. He relished fruit loaf, which is a particular favourite of mine too, so that was always on the offer. In the evenings I would stand by Rita as she played the piano, turning and sorting out the next piece of music. Being raised on Sullivan's music and other turn-of-the-century pieces, we got on famously. I knew that my father played the piano well, but Rita was far more accomplished. She gave greater feeling to her translations. Sally played the piano too, passing 5 exams, but disliked playing in front of anybody, not receiving the same pleasure from playing as her mother. Rita played the piano to a high standard, accompanying the local light opera company and attending their concerts. She often remarked that she had been set to follow a music career, had she not met Harry. I got the impression that she would have preferred the life of a musician rather than being a librarian, which she later became. Although there was a certain amount of romantic longing rather than practical reality about her feelings, she imagined in her daydreams a bohemian lifestyle, not one of a staid bank manager's wife. She often spoke about past lovers and losses with regret. In later life she took up the cello, achieving a sufficiently high standard to be a member of the Wembley Orchestra. Her involvement with a local string quartet and recorder group gave her a busy out-of-home life, which complemented her later schoolwork. The atmosphere of genteel orderliness and attention paid to form, quality and style captivated me. These were all things foreign. Everything was decided by the relationship of one object or colour balancing with another, which picture should balance with a piece of furniture, sympathetic to the overall general decor and mood. This consideration was a revelation. Made total sense, though. Rita thought all things through, giving an educated appraisal of the impression required. She was undoubtedly artistic, literate, and thoughtful. I think she believed she had wasted her talents, and for most part she probably had, although for a woman it would have been difficult to have penetrated a man's world at the time. Priory Gardens is a road of semi-detached houses which runs up from Harrow Road, close to Harrow on the Hill. They were houses built about the same time as those in Cumberland Road, but to a higher standard, being on a larger plot of land. The windows were latticed, set in bay windows to the front. The garden neat but unremarkable, with a small number of fruit trees at the bottom of the garden at the back. The French doors looked out onto the back lawn, the grass mowed by Harry, a task which he never looked forward to, becoming eventually one of mine. Sally's brother Roger went to boarding school, St. Paul's, for the first year when I came to know the family. He had been a chorister at King's College, Cambridge, winning a scholarship. Rita had decided to have him educated away from home. Roger remained in a boarding environment throughout his whole education. Rita believed that this would make him more independent from the family. He was and remained a convivial, hail-fellow, well-met individual. His smile was inviting and genuine. He always had time to talk and had a generous personality. Roger could always be relied on. His keenness to please sometimes got in the way of positive action. He proved to be a very good friend to me. Sally had attended Haberdasher's Ass Girls' School, and because of her inclination to make each subject a challenge, kept in top-class position for most subjects. Her best subjects were literature, English, Latin, and modern languages. Sports of all types were perfect for her longing to succeed, and she belonged to all the school's first teams. Sally had strong views, which she declared forcefully, and was out to win, especially at games. She was also very upset when her mother compared her with a near neighbour, Jennifer, pointing out how helpful and considerate she was to her mother, believing her mother never gave her full credit for anything. Many Saturdays saw me taking Sally to a lacrosse match in Gunnersbury Park, she sitting on the back of my trusty AJS, the evenings spent occupying the back seat of the local picture house, and during the week we usually went for walks together. Come the summer we arranged to spend a week at Warner's holiday camp on the Isle of Wight. and before we set off Sally's father made me promise that I would look after her, which I said I would. I found this loving gesture most kind and thoughtful and just typical of the man. It was planned to sleep in separate chalets next to each other, and in the event we slept together, of course in one bed without engaging in intercourse, being quite content to save the experience for married life, which was by then expected to take place. It was during this holiday we became unofficially engaged, buying a marquisite ring at a jeweller's in Shanklin, which Sally immediately put on. I felt full of the joy of spring, and most sophisticated in my light tweed hacking jacket and dark grey trousers. At last I felt confident. I would concentrate on my job. The future could look after itself. The holiday proved a great success, having any stress removed by a compatible companionship. We were going to share the future together. No hurry to prove our love for each other. Time would do all that. It was a glorious summer holiday, with not a spot of rain in sight. Our walks together along the beach and exploring the countryside about the camp, taking the bus further into the heart of the island, were unforgettable. I became badly sunburned, which took quite a while to heal. It was on our return home that I asked Sally's father, when we were alone together in the sitting-room, if he would agree to us getting married. He said that we had his blessing. We announced a date for the following year, not sure of the timing. I was 22 and Sally 25. We were both excited by the thought of being together, and started to plan for the coming year. First I had to attend a Royal Marine camp in Malta, to last a fortnight as a Z-class reservist. I flew out with the rest of the party in a short Sunderland flying boat from Southampton to Gibraltar, and for a fortnight we trained hard, beaching and drawing off, circling the island many times. Sally sent me airmail letters every day, mainly written with "I love you," covering the pages which was eagerly looked forward to. The rest of the squad looked at me with envious eyes as they stared at the covered paper. Sally had started to knit a brown fairground Fair Isle jumper with an extremely complicated pattern. This took all of Sally's patience and spare time, night after night, knitting away, trying to keep an even tension on all the different coloured wool, so that the pattern didn't have one strand that pulled. The Morgans did not have a television set by choice, nor did they own a car. Rita practised the piano and cello most evenings in the dining room or bedroom to prepare herself for the forthcoming concert. Harry continued reading, filling in his crossword puzzle while attending monthly round table and Rotary evenings. They both decided that they wouldn't buy a television until Harry retired. They took Sally and I to the theatre on a number of occasions to see Sandy Wilson's musicals. Salad Days and The Boyfriend and The Buccaneer performed at the Lyric Hammersmith. At this time Sally was working part-time at a local greengrocer's, earning sufficient money to pay for her way through a secretarial course for typing and shorthand at the Pitman College. Previously she had worked at the Bank of England, a position her father had obtained for her, which was not at all suitable for her. Enclosed in a large institution was not something Sally would ever have liked, and having to use the Underground Railway was also something she disliked doing, and was a fear which never went away. She dislikes banks now, banking and officialdom. All these fears and dislikes ended any hopes her father might have had in that direction. This decision didn't go down well with either of her parents. We met when Sally was undergoing a Pitman Secretariat course. She finished her training and passed the examination to give her all the skills she needed. A vacancy for a medical secretary became vacant at Wembley Hospital, and Sally applied and passed the interview. It didn't take her long to understand and apply medical terminology to the letters transposed from audio recordings, typing up letters from shorthand notes, which she was not so keen on doing, and as the hospital was only 2 miles from her home in Sudbury Hill, Sally cycled there every day. National Service had upset the normal course of an age-old custom linked to my apprenticeship. This I considered fortunate. I missed the banging out ceremony, heralds the completion of an apprenticeship reaching journeyman status. However, I did not get away without having to stand the firm a drink over at the local pub for both my engagement to Sally and my new position. In 1956, industrial production in Japan achieved pre-war levels, and West Germany, helped by 3 million refugees from the East, surpassed Britain's car production figures. The printing industry, controlled by the newspaper industry, whose workers, always the most militant, annually demanded better working conditions. The men composing type, the compositors, held the newspaper proprietors to ransom, usually getting their way. This had a knock-on effect onto the other printing processes, forcing up their wages, improving their conditions. Most other industrial workers looked to the militant to hitch their coattails to. The printing industry was not the only powerful group. The dockers controlled the import of food, and the miners controlled the power. The whole country rode on this era of increased affluence. Employment figures were up, and there were not enough skilled workers trained to develop many new production techniques originally designed pre-war but now being introduced. From this time onwards, home-produced cars and motorbikes lost out to the more reliable Japanese models. Eventually, Britain's car, truck and motorbike industry failed to foreign competitors whose products were less rust-prone and higher component specifications had mounted later engine designs. On the 31st of October that year, Britain, France and Israel attacked Egypt. The loss of the war by retiring from Egypt before a satisfactory completion, caused by American pressure, lost the country valuable industrial production and exports, but it also interrupted vital oil supplies. All these were taken together, created a run on sterling, and caused a loss of credibility and prestige. Macmillan had the job of putting a brake on rising prices and maintaining the value of the pound. That year there was a destructive printing strike which went on for weeks and caused much bitterness and strife. Its net result made a number of firms move out of London altogether and caused others to close down. Prefabricated houses were built during the war to house bombed-out survivors. They were ready-made, easily erected, single-floor bungalows, very much like a large caravan. Tower blocks were now replacing those iconic utilitarian homes. City and towns, bombed-out areas, were completely changed from their original Victorian buildings by new slab-sided, easily constructed offices. Concrete framed windows, stairs and landings steel tubed that replaced brick, individual window panes, stained glass, wrought iron railings and moulded brickwork were all anathema. It was the turn of minimalism, easy fix and pre-construction. It was thought that by consulting architects that what people wanted was high-rise blocks to house the maximum number of families so that more space around would compensate for the lack of gardens. Every part of the country had their own soulless creations that repeated a sameness of not only the social outcome of disaffected youths with nothing to do but a soulless conformity. The place was lacking totally in individualism. The massive increase in industrial competition from the beaten access countries, helped by the Marshall Plan to ward off communism, started to prove too much for Britain's outdated, worn-out factories and machinery. It was very much easier to start up a modern system of production when starting from scratch rather than cobbling on the latest innovation onto an old previous model. Foreign governments subsidized the building of modern factories which could undercut Britain's prices. Our trade unions demanded one man for one job, which was inflexible and anachronistic. Work gradually went abroad, especially when it seemed to be more often than not there was industrial action here to increase wages and reduce the working week. In the printing industry, particularly in the pre-printing side of the industry, typesetting and picture reproduction was now computer-generated. The writing was on the wall. Labour was going to be replaced by machines. Fixed-sized presses superseded rotary book presses. Standardization became an important factor in pricing. The rapid development of photographic typesetting to assemble a complete page continued apace. It was clear that letterpress typesetting and block making was in decline. It was a question of how fast would the print house owners change their equipment and come to terms with what was clearly going to happen. Fortunately for the workers, this didn't come about as fast as predicted. Society expected you to get a job immediately on leaving school, a percentage paid over to your mother to help with the housekeeping. It was expected that you would get married after a reasonable period of engagement of, say, 2 years, and then, when in your early to middle 20s you got married in a church. You rented a flat, either furnished or unfurnished, to allow you to save hard for a deposit to take out a mortgage, to buy your first home. Children were to be the result of that marriage after a reasonable period taken to gather basic furniture together. It was late in 1956 when there was a lengthy printing strike which caused great bitterness between the management and workers. The works director of Chroma Works couldn't deal with Frank Clements, the union representative. He was a confirmed socialist, very interested in social reform. He wouldn't accept that the management could not increase the workers' wages. There was talk of a walkout leading to strike action. Eventually, he was asked to step down as father of the chapel. As usual, the workers' demand was for a reduction in working hours, longer holidays and more money. Eventually, the bosses concluded a deal and we all went back to work. However, the eventual outcome was the closing down of the artist studio over a period of a year. One man retired. 2 men went as trainee retouchers to Sun Gravure Works, and 2 men retained at Chroma Works as retouchers. And 2 of us went to Wood, Rosler and Wilkes in Willesden. Shortly afterwards, Chroma Works closed down their Neasden factory and went to Nottingham, becoming part of the British Printing Corporation. This firm was also a general printer, similar to size to Chroma Works, which was more welcoming, intended to retain their artist studio in the hope that they would pick up work from firms closing their studios too. My fiancée and I not discussed having children before we were married. It wasn't a subject shunned because it was embarrassed and just denied importance. We hadn't even discussed where we would eventually buy a house, or how we would furnish it if we had, and certainly what style or period of decoration we preferred. It was almost as if life would just follow on what had taken place before, only now we would do it together. Our marriage was planned for the 3rd week in March 1957, time to take full advantage of the end of tax year rebate. This rather clinical regard for tax rebate was worth planning for, and used by most couples thinking of getting married. We took ourselves off to see the Vicar of St. Andrew's, Sudbury, to inquire about what the marriage procedure was, about when the banns were going to be read. We had very little money, and had to save like mad, not only for the wedding and honeymoon, but also for the flat in Harrow Road and essentials. The wedding breakfast held at Priory Gardens by Harry and Rita Morgan, who had explained to Sally and me that we had had a choice, a wedding with all the trimmings, or a simple event, plus a cheque for £500. As I've explained, we were very hard up, and took the kind offer with gratitude. For the occasion I had a new suit, and Sally had a fitted costume with an A-line light blue topcoat and hat, which she soon discarded, never liking such accessories. Round her throat hung a single string of pearls, and pinned to her coat a posy. Sally hated dressing up, and never ever got used to doing so. Such formalities and rites were anathema to her. She was all for sporting gear and casual wear. I rolled up to the church by bus from Harrow. Dropping me off at the bottom of the road, I walked in plenty of time to the church, up the aisle before the altar. There I mused. Was I doing the right thing? My doubts vanished by finality and completeness. No more disruptions. I must get on with life and stop worrying about things. It was a fine spring day, warm and sunny, heralding a new life about to begin. Eventually the main guests arrived, including Vera, my godmother, up from Somerset, and Roger, Sally's brother, my best man. Sally drove to the church in a hire car and walked up the aisle with her father. It was a simple affair, no choir or bells rung, although there was an organist. The hymns we had chosen, enthusiastically endorsed by Sally's parents, sung with enthusiasm. It was a lovely, happy occasion, with the minimum of ceremony and fuss. After the ceremony, Sally and I waited in the wedding car for all the guests to make their own way back to Priory Gardens, which was only 5 minutes' walk away, and then we drove up in the car. Harry and Rita had laid on a fine selection of ready-made sandwiches, cakes and biscuits. A fine toast by Sally's father preceded champagne and cutting the wedding cake. From now on I was to call them Dad and Mum. They never asked me to do so, and I was never embarrassed using the familiar term. It just seemed the natural thing to do. I became part of their extended family, and from that day on I never needed better. When we eventually arrived at Waterloo Station via the dreaded Underground Railway, which Sally hated going on, we boarded the mainline train for Portsmouth, which would take us to the pier where we were to catch the ferry to the island. A taxi took us to the hotel where all the guests, we discovered, were on their honeymoons too. The honeymoon was booked at Clifftop Hotel Shanklin, the Isle of Wight. Our marriage state obvious, for who else would go on holiday in March, cold, wet and windy? The hotel was full of such couples, all on their honeymoon. Our week was soon over. I have read that these events are not easy affairs, and ours was certainly not the most relaxed. We were in fact embarrassed, which was silly because we had spent the previous summer together on holiday, sharing the same bed, and perhaps we should have talked the matter through, but we didn't, being both unsure and inexperienced. We were not the world's greatest lovers, and the run-up to the wedding and aftermath caused its own stress. There is something to be said for trial marriages, understanding all that is involved about making love with all the expectations that should follow. By itself, the hotel was fine, and the Isle of Wight provided the necessary backdrop to the start of married life. However, we survived to find ourselves outside the Harrow Road furnished flat we rented. My motorbike was propped up in the road, arriving back home with £40 in the bank and a lot of hard saving to look forward to. The owners were a funny lot, because whatever they did, they made a lot of noise about it. There was an amazing amount of banging and crashing, with shouts and screams which reverberated from one side of the house to the other. This was our nightly entertainment, which didn't go to make our love-making any more accomplished. In fact, it put Sally right off. At one time I'm sure the man threw a chair that bounced from one wall in their kitchen to the other. Our rooms were sparsely furnished, and the kitchen positively barren. The bed creaked, the floor echoed, and Sally was homesick, to the extent that she spent all her time back at Priory Gardens. It was all quite hopeless, and no way to carry on. This lasted about a month before father-in-law decided that he'd had enough, and the situation would have to change. An unfurnished flat, number 8 Meadow Road, became available in Pinner. A Lloyd's Bank employee had occupied it, and we had the chance to fill it, which we did with much rejoicing after paying a deposit. We could now use all the things we had both collected to stock our bottom drawer, and we moved in May 1957, after its total redecoration. We furnished the flat with a kitchen table, 2 chairs, divan, double bed, green carpet square, 2 Cintiq armchairs, a G-plan wardrobe and chest of drawers, and all the other bits and pieces needed to make up an ongoing home. With those, and an orange box covered with a tablecloth that supported the black and white TV, we were all set for our married life to begin together in our unfurnished flat. My in-laws kindly bought us a magnificent mason's tea service made in the Strathmore design, which became our pride and joy. It was always a pleasure to use it, but, with all most precious things with a large family, accidents took their toll. My motorcycle I kept down the side passage to wheel out every day to take me to work come rain or shine. It was not long before I wanted a larger machine. I discussed this with Trevor. He advised buying a bike such as his, being familiar with its construction and servicing. He knew that it was reliable and recommended his BSA 500 Twin, and with that advice I looked round the various showrooms and eventually found one at Slocum's in Neasden. What a difference it made compared to my AJS, and the BSA was certainly a pleasure to ride. Sally continued to work at Wembley Hospital and cycled there every day, come wet or shine. Her push bike, with the wicker basket on the front, often with the day's shopping inside, had to negotiate Harrow Hill, and Sally used it as a challenge to get up without stopping to push. The house we shared with the Turners, who lived on the ground floor. Mrs. Turner and her daughter did housewife for local people, and her son worked for the council. Living with a family below was a strain, particularly when Sally repeatedly cleared her throat at night. The result would be a tremendous banging on the ceiling below with a broom handle, and frosty glances during the day. Mrs. Turner was always a few centimetres away from the drawn net curtains that twitched every time we went out. It wasn't long after being married that Chromaworks shut down their artist studio. The management gave 3 months' warning, saying that they could retain half the staff to be lithographic colour retouchers, those who had been with the firm the longest. The 3 of us who had to leave asked by the management what we intended to do. George Clement said he would retire, and Fred and I went to fill positions within a local printing house called Wood Rosler and Willesden. Everyone was satisfied that the best had been done to see their future catered for. The firm kept my wages at the same level, which, considering my newly married state, was very welcome. It didn't take me long to fit in with what the other men were doing. My previous skills stood me in good stead, and Campbell Gilbert, detailed off as my instructor, was an adept tutor, interested in the job and open-minded about new technical methods. There was an enormous amount of handwork still to do on both the continuous tone negatives and screen positives, and because so much time was devoted to masking out the negatives, I had a chance to take in what was going on around me and to adapt quickly to the new working environment and skills I had to acquire. When first married, 10 years after the war, the nation's conventions, behaviour and habits were based on pre-war patterns that had evolved over generations. My marriage was the culmination of my longing to settle down and plan for a better life, to share goals, interests and outcomes. We hadn't discussed whether we were going to have children or how we would bring them up if we had. Getting together, courting, our engagement, marriage and early life together all followed conventional behavioural patterns. This conformity spilled over into shared tasks within the home, and from overheard conversations sexual behaviour too. Having children was included in our forward thinking, although not spoken about. Although individual children are not all the same within a social class, lifestyle patterns are. The changing culture in Britain promoted the welfare interest of children. This was to play an important part in the future consideration of married partners. Sally and I continued to live in Pinner throughout my years of retraining, and subsequently when I moved on to a job with son Litho at Ruislip. I applied for the position as a fully trained retoucher, although the work considerably more advanced. At least 5 of us at Wood Rosler from different departments went to son Litho, a relatively new plate makers and provers who were taking advantage of the boom in litho, taking over from letterpress. The latest Kodak tri-masking systems were used, which ensured less handwork, and the retouchers had to do their own page planning. The Roland flatbed proving machines, 3 in all, were the latest design, all brand spanking new. Planners took the separate pages to plan into sheet position, ready for plate making. Sun Litho was a plate making firm for the lithographic printing industry, and as such had to make a profit from only that source. This competition from independent colour separation studios, plate makers, film planners and provers became an inherent part of the printing industry, and over time created faster and cheaper techniques. Competition became fierce. For all book production, whatever the printing process, films showing type matter and screened half-tone pictures were cut, patched and planned to form pages. These pages in sheet position are now ready for printing. The position of a page on a plate is relative to the size of printing machine, number of pages in the book, and the method of cutting, folding and gathering. Planning separate films, both screen positives and pictures, type matter in page position onto a clear plastic foil, both stable to heat and cold condition, was a considerable improvement on letterpress, having to set type and picture blocks into a form. The surface of the aluminium printing plate was coated with a light-sensitive emulsion which hardened when exposed to light. The opaque black image areas held back the light, leaving those areas capable of being removed and replaced to be made ink receptive. Within a very short period, many letterpress workers were made redundant. To absorb these workers, keep them in the printing industry and in the same union, apprenticeships were curtailed and a retraining program instigated. It was not many years before the photogravure industry followed the letterpress industry's downturn. All this was the start to a massive restructuring of the printing industry, which is still going on today, driven by electronic image generation. Throughout this period the trade union held legal strength. As previously explained, it was not just in the printing industry that it resulted in poor growth. The obvious restrictive practices stifled the growth of productivity, put off firms seeking greater profits, investing in new machines. Unions were always trying to improve the conditions for their members, because this was their main task. Therefore the pressure on the economy increased. Managements did not stand a chance to resist, having all that political power against them. In the coming years, when Labour in office, there was a marked increase in this growth of public sector employment. This spiral of wage claims, strikes, inflation, and relying on restraint to curb an ever-increasing enactment of the position was destined to fail. To maintain, perhaps increase, my living standard, employers had to be progressive, be efficient, and use the latest technology. This meant that I had to move firms every 2 or 3 years, move to progressive firms keeping abreast of new techniques. It was no good staying at the same place out of sentimentality, because wages wouldn't keep pace with the cost of living. Most plate-making firms paid precisely the same rate to all employees, believing that there would be no industrial friction between skills if all paid the same rate. This didn't prove to be so. This was neither economical nor in the best interest of production, however much it pandered to social engineering and the rights of workers. That meant that you couldn't seek a rise for greater productivity, because that would mean that others would feel threatened. It would show that greater productivity could be made by admitting that this one man was better at his job than another. And who was going to be the judge? If a wage rise given, then that man should have all the most difficult work to do. In some instances, workers agreed amongst themselves to accept the same rate and ensure total transparency. Working in such an environment, one quickly became aware that some men were better than others. Some slowed the work rate down so that others could keep up, and others sat back, just waiting and enjoying it all. The common denominator for the slowest speed to be the norm, working at the same rate for the same pay. This is patent nonsense. Even if the standard of final work was the same, which never happened, quality and quantity gradually declined. However, new methods and machines came into production faster than humans changed behaviour. There was a general belief by Labour's government of Clement Attlee's 1945 to 61 and Harrow Wilson's 1964 to 1970 that the trades union and various social welfare groups should plan events in favour of so-called underprivileged groups, workers who were less skilled. It is as well that in the early 60s there was a great post-war boom driven by cheap energy. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan attributed saying, "You have never had it so good," and from 1951 to 1963, sandwiched between two Labour governments, there had been a Conservative administration practically covering the whole period of which I write. In 1961, life expectancy for males was 70 and females 74. The rate of employment growth in Britain was 3.2, the lowest for the 7 largest Western economies in the world. The place of women was particularly difficult. The war years had seen a tremendous influx of women into not only the armed services but into industry too. There would be no turning back. Women sought parity with men in all fields. Women's jobs in printing factories were for warehouse duties. Apprenticeships and trainee positions for girls only started in the early 80s. Girls just out of school no longer thought about getting married and having children. It was now about getting a job, fulfilling ambitions, and becoming independent. The economy was thrusting ahead, which continued for over a year. Working conditions negotiated on an annual basis, in retrospect always the same. Longer holidays, shorter working, and an annual increase to keep abreast of inflation. Overtime worked by the majority at least 2 nights for 4.5 hours per week, and Saturday mornings from 6 to 12. New firms were opening up every week, offering better wages and conditions, and there was a steady turnaround of staff. In the 60s, the industrial unrest centred on the shipbuilding industry, dockside workers, mines and motorworks. This had the effect of turning young people off all those jobs for fear of being involved and losing wages. The long-term result was a lack of suitably trained workers within all industries. The emergence of web offset printing from continuous reels of paper for the production of local newspapers and periodicals cut costs, introduced better quality pictures, and started the use of colour. This was the beginning of steps taken to restructure the printing workforce. The 3 main printing processes, letterpress, gravure and lithography, competed with each other for the print run jobs. A print run of 500,000 copies. Letterpress held on to newspaper production, mainly because the production set-up long established and would be expensive to change, and the strength of the letterpress chapels had always held the management to ransom. Letterpress also controlled book production for a similar reason, although from a union point of view their power diminished. Their profits were not from advertisers and deadlines. Photogravure existed for long runs, magazine production in the millions. Lithography printed labels, holiday brochures, lesser magazine runs, greetings cards, prints and jobbing work. And by the 1960s it was very clear that the two former surpassed the latter. All the most modern innovations, flatbed scanners, studio cameras, film and foils, printing machines and rotary machine plates pointed the way. The printing industry was heading towards a radical change. In fact, it was a revolution. Countries abroad influenced change too. Their workforce, flexible, easily controlled, dominated by strong management. New techniques, working arrangements and modern machines were quickly introduced without renegotiating new arrangements. These undercut Britain's industrial effectiveness. In Britain, the newspaper industry continued to run on pre-war working methods. Abroad, mainly in Holland and Singapore, faster and cheaper lithographic processes undercut prices. Their use of film for the production of type matter, multiple images and scanners for 4-colour reproductions gave them the edge on price and time. Foreign governments financially assisted their country's printing industry. Britain could no longer compete. In 1963 to 64 saw the 12-month premiership of Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the surprise choice of the Conservative Party. He predictably came across as a reliable, trustworthy Prime Minister who unfortunately had no persona for television and the media. He was a bad choice, not because his politics were bad, but because he didn't reflect this age of youth and scientific progress. There was to be great changes in industrial development, which did not bode well for Sally and me, planning our way ahead. It was considered by government think tanks that motorways was the answer to traffic hold-ups. 1963 heralded the introduction to town planners and developers, proclaiming a new architectural design to progress a brighter future, the promotion of concrete, roads, embankments, slab-sided buildings, bridges, institutional buildings and council offices. Cities and towns, 40 years later, decried this misplaced zeal, began to haul down these edifices to blighted opinion. When we had been living at Pinner for just over a year, Sally decided that it was time for us to think about having a family. We were still saving hard for our own house, and the thought of having to do without one salary in our saving strategy was worrying. The question of having to start planning for a baby was a shock, and what about the long-term effects? We had never discussed having children, or if children came along, what size family we should have. In fact, Sally had never shown any desire for children at all, or even enjoyed their company, or showed any regard for babies, or been envious of mothers-to-be. It was almost an out-of-character act for someone so sporting. However, Sally was not to be put off by financial considerations. Here was a challenge that required dedication. If others could have children, then so could we. Any thought about waiting until we had our own house was out of the question. So the decision was made that a pregnancy should be tried for after 2 years of married life. For me, to be making love most nights was an enjoyable experience, and there being no need for contraceptives, a liberating and satisfying time. But for Sally it was a mission, not something to be fulfilled or by enjoyed. After a couple of months of trying for a baby with no results, Sally began to question what was wrong. She consulted friends and colleagues at work, and as she was still working at Wembley Hospital, she was in the right place to gain some of the answers. Eventually, the family doctor was consulted. The usual advice was given to achieve pregnancy, which was to give it time, be patient, relaxed, achieve the right temperature and posture. All of these things I had in plenty, but for Sally it was frustrating. At last the day came when Sally had the pregnancy test, which proved that she was. It was a time of satisfaction and expectation. Sally still cycled to work, and the months ticked up to the time she had to give up work in a few weeks before the birth. That year we spent our holiday at a farm in Timberscombe in Devon, close to Dunster and its castle. I can still see the large bowl of cream placed on our table for every meal, and the porridge too, made with cream and full cream milk, provided for breakfast. In the afternoon a cream tea served, and once again there was the cream placed before us in a large bowl. On one of our motorcycle trips out around the lanes near Rickmansworth, we sped round a corner to meet a car coming in the opposite direction. The leaves on the wet road presented no grip, and we drove straight into it. I gripped onto the handlebars like glue. Sally, meanwhile, flew over both my head and the oncoming car. I sustained a broken wrist, and she nothing at all. I made my way to Mount Vernon Hospital, where my wrist was put into plaster. The damaged motorbike transported to a garage in Wealdstone, where it was repaired, never to be quite the same again, being out of balance, the frame slightly twisted. That made us very aware that from now on our family's safety was paramount. That summer I started to take driving lessons in a standard Pennant car, setting off with a hill climb up the hill to the cinema along Pinner High Street, or trying to pull out from the parked cars going down towards Love Lane. Riding a motorcycle had made me road conscious, so it didn't take me long to get the hang of driving. I managed to pass in 11 lessons, which was a relief because we badly needed the money. I sold the Triumph 650cc, which I bought in place of the BSA 9 months before, and bought from a friend, Colin Reuter, who ran a garage along the Pinner Road, a pale yellow Ford Anglia 1500 weight van for £150. It had only 3 forward gears and a side valve engine, but much needed for a growing family, and gave noble service. It never let us down. Stan, by this time, had gone into the motor industry from being an agricultural engineer, was in the servicing department at Dagenham Motors, Alberton, and they took over servicing my car. Often I wondered, after sampling dry, warm motoring, why on earth I had continued with the motorbike. Those freezing cold fingers, wet chilled knees, waterlogged shoes and bulky weatherproof clothes, not to mention those awful raised white lines on a wet day coming round a corner, that if you got one wheel on one side of the line and the other wheel on the other, it meant a possible fall. This was the same feeling experienced when going over a polished manhole cover or a pile of rotting leaves. Alternatively, the heart-stopping moments when a motorist suddenly opened his door, adjusted wiper blades, cleansed the windscreen, or turned sharply in front of you. Now we had a family to care for. Our first child, a boy, was born on the 5th of February 1960 at Wembley Hospital Maternity Unit. We named him Simon Roger after Sally's brother. I was 25 and Sally 28, delighted that the birth had been a success, without any complications. After 10 days, Sally, released from hospital, carrying Simon, we drove back to her parents' home, thinking that there would be she could rely upon her mother to make the passage of parenthood easier, and could develop a routine to transfer back to Pinner. It was a relief that her parents were so near, and that Rita was happy to put up with the invasion. It was a good situation which lasted for a couple of weeks, but like all good things, had to end. We got all the new infant's bits and pieces together, and with Sally's case journeyed back to Pinner. And when we got there, we unloaded the pram and wheeled it up to the front door. There, we suddenly realized the awful truth. The pram was too big, and wouldn't, with any twisting, turning, tipping, tugging, be enticed round the front door and up the stairs to the flat. It was, at this stage, Sally getting more and more upset, and refused to proceed, declared that we were to return to Priory Gardens immediately. Our fateful return convinced the in-laws that here was a crisis that they had to correct, being too well aware that they would have to put up with an invasion yet again unless desperate measures taken. A powwow produced a solution. We had to have our own home, and fast. Harry scanned the local papers for houses for sale. Both he and I went in the van to see some of the houses on offer while Sally stayed behind with Simon. We had talked through the financial situation, knowing that I had this Provident Life policy, which could be used to provide a loan for a house purchase. When I was 17, my Aunt Nan had taken me to one side to explain that I should devote some of my wages to take out a Provident Life policy, to save with, and later convert to house purchase. Now this seemed like an ideal situation, and I completed the paperwork at once. This cost me in the region of £17 a month, which was a lot of money to me, being almost 1 week's wages. How pleased I was when it became clear that this policy would be our salvation, for it allowed us to put down as a deposit £2,300, which was what we needed. However, it was finally announced that we needed another £500. My father-in-law stumped up the amount needed, put the transaction through the bank's lawyer, and checked the paperwork. How lucky we were that he was a bank manager, fully conversant with such matters. Sally turned down a number of houses we looked at, being unsuitable, either too small or in a position which to her was unacceptable. At last we came upon 68 Norwood Drive, which at first glance would provide all that Sally desired. She gave it the thumbs up, and we speedily made our way to the estate agent. The purchase arrangements were speedily completed, and we became the proud owners, knowing that there was to be much work that needed to be done to put it in a state suitable to receive our new family. All my spare time was spent scrubbing floors, stripping old wallpaper, painting, and planning the new kitchen. Sally and I agreed to name the house Harbury, adopting Har, my home town, Harrow, and Bury from Sudbury, her home. The sign graced the front porch, hanging from the door canopy. It was very exciting to own our own home. I couldn't stop myself from walking round and round the house, thinking how lucky we were. It was about this time that Harry took early retirement from the bank at the age of 60. He had looked forward to this moment with relish. He was now going to do all the things he had been dreaming of, being a grandfather, watching cricket, cycling, reading, and perhaps most of all buying their first television and watching westerns. His face would wrinkle up in a tremendous smile. He would draw an even greater mouthful of smoke in and exhale it through his teeth, as the wonderful thoughts, expectations, and delights regaled him. Now he could devote all his energies and time to fulfill his dreams.